What do you think the 3 problems are with this version of Fur Release? Well, in today's video, I'm going to explain the 3 major problems that make your playing sound messy. And at the end of this video, I'm going to play Fur Release once again with all of these problems fixed. So let's get into it. So let's get into the first problem. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to play Chopin's Prelude in E minor and see if you can work out what the problem is. Could you work it out? Well, the first problem, and perhaps the most obvious, is holding the pedal for far too long. Now, using the pedal on the piano actually does have some rules around it, or things that you typically should do in order to make your piano playing sound less messy. And when I talk about the piano pedal, I'm really talking about the sustain pedal, which on a normal acoustic piano or a grand piano would be the pedal that's on the far right of the pedals. But on electric pianos, you typically only have one pedal, and that will be the sustain pedal. Now, for a lot of beginners, they never actually get taught when to actually use the sustain pedal, and this leads to kind of really messy sounding playing. So the general rule for when you are supposed to use the pedal is when the chords change. So in a piece like Chopin's Prelude, where you have very clear chord changes in the left hand, like that, you need to release the pedal and re-pedal so that the old chord is no longer being sustained and you don't have those notes kind of running into the new chord. And this is actually exactly the same even if the chord notes aren't played together. So for example, in Fur Release, where you've got these 3 notes, that kind of outlines a chord, and then this outlines a different chord, so therefore you'll need to re-pedal so that those 2 chords don't clash. Now, when I say re-pedal, I actually mean something very specific, because there is actually 2 forms of pedaling that you can do. There is direct pedaling, and there is indirect pedaling. Now, direct pedaling is where you press the pedal down at the same time that you play the notes in your hand. So at the start of a piece, when you play the first note, you'll put the pedal down at the same time as the notes in your hand. And this typically works if you are pressing the pedal down for the first time, so that might be at the beginning of a piece of music, or it might be in the middle of a piece, but when you've not had the pedal down for a while, you'll press the pedal at the same time as your hand is going down. However, this is not the majority of pedaling. The majority of pedaling is actually something called indirect pedaling. And this is where you already have the pedal down from the previous chord that you played. Let's say this is this chord, but you have to lift the pedal up on the first note of the next chord, like this, and then press it down again, so that you are clearing the previous chord, but then re-pedaling the new chord at the same time. So with indirect pedaling, you're actually lifting the pedal up at the same time as the note, and then pressing it down immediately afterwards. So in a piece of music, you might direct pedal, and then indirect pedal, like that. If you direct pedal both chords, so you press it down at the same time as your hand, in order to press it down at the same time as this next chord, you have to have lifted it up and press it down again, which leaves a small gap in the music. So that is why we have to indirect pedal, to avoid that small gap, but also make sure that there's no overlapping between the chords. Not knowing when to pedal in a piece of music, regardless whether that's a pop song or a classical piece, it is the biggest cause of making your playing sound messy. And if you know when to pedal, this actually makes you sound a lot more professional on the piano. And here is an example of that. If I don't play the pedal at all and I play a series of chords, that sounds quite amateur and quite boring, whereas if I pedal each of those chords, it immediately sounds much more professional. And there are some situations in music where you don't want to pedal at all. If you are trying to create a particularly detached effect or something like that, then you might not want to use the pedal at all. But if you want a piece of music to sound flowing, then you need to make sure that you are pedaling every time the chords change. So here is Chopin's Prelude in E minor one more time, correctly pedaled. So here is problem number 2, and to demonstrate this, I'm going to play As Long As He Needs Me from the musical Oliver. Don't ask me why, but it just happens to be the first song that came to my head. Could you tell what the problem was that time? Well, although I pedalled while the chords changed during that piece, it did sound like I was still pedaling incorrectly. And the reason for that is because I was still clinging onto those notes with my fingers. And I actually hear this a lot when people play scales, for example. Often when beginners play scales, they tend to kind of forget to let go of the notes that they've just played and end up overlapping them. And if you do this in a piece of music, once again, you're at risk of making it sound really messy because you'll have chord notes that are clashing against each other, or melody notes that are next to each other that are clashing. Particularly if you're going to the effort of making sure that you are changing the pedal when the chords change, it's worth making sure that you also aren't holding onto those notes with your fingers. And there are a couple of reasons other than the notes just clashing as to why it doesn't sound good when you do this. First of all, if you are playing a melody on the piano, you are essentially trying to replicate something like a singer. And a singer can't sing multiple notes at the same time, so they go from one note to the next without any overlapping at all. So if you overlap the notes on the piano, you kind of ruin the illusion of the melody that you're creating. And the second reason for this is more of a technical one. If you are holding down notes, you're more likely to create tension in your hands because your hands are not as flexible and movable as they are if you just let go of the notes. For example, if I play this in the left hand and my next note is this, if I'm clinging onto these notes, I'm going to create tension trying to move my hand to play this note. Whereas if my hands can move freely and I can just pedal the gap there, then my hand can stay relaxed. So if this is a problem that you are having, then it's worth spending a lot of time playing scales, making sure that you can play the notes independently. But also, when you're playing pieces of music, slow it down and try and work out if you are overlapping the notes in any places, and deliberately fix that problem. Eventually, it will become the way that you naturally play. So here is As Long As He Needs Me, once again, without the overlapping notes. So for the third problem, I'm going to play the song Happy Birthday. So let's see if you can work out what the problem is this time. Could you work out the problem? Well, this time, the problem is that there is no balance between the different elements in the piece of music, so the melody is getting drowned out. One of the hardest things about playing the piano specifically is trying to get some notes to be louder than other notes. That is hard enough between two different hands, but it's even harder when it's one note in one hand that you're trying to make stand out above the rest. But the problem is that the melody is where the interest is. This is the thing that a listener is going to listen to the most. It's the narrative of the song or the piece of music. Whereas the chords create the feeling that goes underneath that narrative. And if the melody gets drowned out, then you don't really have anything to latch onto and listen to. So you're just hearing this big sound and you don't really know where to put your attention. So there are two things that I would say for this. First of all, you need to make sure that you are prioritizing the melody over everything else. So if you are going to sacrifice something in a piece of music, it shouldn't be the melody, because that is the thing that's going to disturb the listener's experience the most. But the second thing I would say, which is more a technical thing, is how you can actually physically solve this if you find it hard to play some notes louder than others. And a good exercise that I often teach for this is to play two chords in both hands, like a C major chord, for example, and then try and get each one of these notes to be the loudest. So you start with the top note of the right hand, then the middle note of the right hand, then the bottom note of the right hand, top note of the left hand, middle note of the left hand, and then the bottom note of the left hand. If you can do that and get control of your hands like that, then when it comes to getting a melody to stand out, physically, you won't have to think about it so much. You'll just be able to kind of use your ears to get the notes to sing out. And that's not to say that there isn't a place for making chords sound big and deprioritizing the melody in certain places. However, generally speaking, the melody is the thing that you're going to want to prioritize in terms of what a listener is going to be listening to. So here is Happy Birthday once again, but this time with the melody not being drowned out by the chords. So as promised, I'm going to play Fur Release once again with these 3 problems fixed. First of all, I'm going to pedal every time the chords change. Secondly, I'm not going to overlap the notes with my fingers. And thirdly, I'm going to make sure the melody can be heard. So here is how I played it at the beginning of the video. And here it is with those 3 problems fixed. Let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced any of these 3 problems in your playing. And if you want to know 3 mistakes that might be making you sound amateur on the piano, then head on through and I will see you there.